With her power secure, Catherine picks up where Peter the Great left off, transforming Russia into a world power.
As a foreigner, as a European, she virtually completed the process of Europeanization, which Peter the Great had begun at the beginning of the century. In fact, Catherine regarded herself as Peter's rightful heir.
In the 18th century, in order to be a successful monarch, you had to expand your territory, and this Catherine did brilliantly.
Catherine annexed some 200,000 square miles of territory, adding vast new wealth to Russia's coffers and expanding the empire to its greatest lengths to date.
Second, you were to introduce a wide-ranging program of reform, and this she did.
On the home front, Catherine used her new wealth to modernize her city. She was one of the first Russian rulers to address the squalid living conditions of Russia's poor, with plans for hospitals, sanitation, services, and schools.
Catherine, during her reign, set up architectural norms for the building of new towns, and she did, in fact, build 216 new towns, complete with plans for how the grid should be laid out, how the central square should be laid out, what kind of facades there should be, what kind of materials should be used in construction.
But Catherine's most prestigious building project was the renovation of her royal residence, the empire's most extravagant monument to self-indulgence, the Winter Palace. The Winter Palace was 3 stories high and 650 feet long. The entire exterior was decorated in more than 200 columns and over 150 carved statues. Inside, it contained more than 500 rooms, almost 4 times the number of rooms in the White House. Over the course of her reign, Catherine spearheaded a building boom unlike any the empire had ever seen. Her unrivaled power completely transformed St. Petersburg into an ostentatious and unashamed display of the culture, wealth, and power of the Russian Empire.
She wrote to one of her correspondents, "I can't stop myself from building, but building is like a disease. It's almost like alcoholism."
Unrestrained building wasn't the Tsarina's only vice. Behind the doors of the Winter Palace, Catherine was known for another form of patronage, taking good care of her numerous and often much younger lovers.
She was a hard-working woman. At night, she wanted to have male company. And there were a number of lovers. She treated them very nicely and very generously. She gave them land, she gave them serfs.
But Catherine's lavish court and her absolute power to give human beings as gifts symbolized the gulf that existed between the ruling elite and the average laboring Russian. While she sympathized with her subjects, on the throne of supreme power, Catherine's reforms went only so far. By the end of Catherine's reign in 1796, Russia was a superpower. But the country's strength brought it new glory and new enemies. By 1812, Europe's most ambitious general was engaged in a march of conquest across Europe, unlike any seen since the Roman Empire, and Russia was about to become his next victim.
Catherine the Great was the first leader to initiate a large-scale inoculation program. In 1768, she immunized herself and her subjects against smallpox.
At the time of her death in 1796, Catherine had added 200,000 square miles of territory to the Russian Empire. Over 40 million people were now considered Russians. When her grandson, Alexander I, took the throne in 1801, Russia was a major player in world affairs. This made Russia an alluring trophy for Europe's most dangerous general, Napoleon Bonaparte. And in 1812, Tsar Alexander would face a challenge unseen in Russia since the Mongol invasion 6 centuries earlier.
Napoleon posed a considerable threat to Russia. He had already brought virtually all of Europe under his control.
Napoleon entered Russia with an unprecedented army of over 500,000 men. The Russians knew they could not stop this army on the battlefield, so they adopted a tactic of strategic retreat, burning the countryside to starve out Napoleon's troops as they pushed toward Moscow. Once in the capital, Napoleon would realize he had underestimated the steely resolve of the Russian Tsar.
Napoleon probably thought that having invaded Russia, seized the old capital, Alexander would be willing to come to terms with him. Alexander was not. He simply ignored Napoleon until a very harsh winter forced Napoleon to realize that there was nothing to be gained by sitting in Moscow, and so Napoleon began to retreat.
Forced to march back over the demolished and frozen landscape from which they came, less than 10% of the men out of Napoleon's original army survived. Mother Russia had broken the unbeatable general. In 1883, Alexander's successor commissioned a grand monument to be placed in the heart of St. Petersburg's Palace Square. It would be a towering symbol of Russian defiance. It was called the Alexander Column.
The Alexander Column rests on a granite shaft, red finish granite. It's a monolith, it's one piece.
Once again, a Russian Tsar forced his people to literally move mountains to build a monument in the name of the empire. An army of Russians methodically carved the shaft of the column out of the side of a mountain in one piece and shipped it to St. Petersburg. It was a process that took 3 years and thousands of workers. Once in St. Petersburg, engineers faced the daunting task of raising the 700-ton, 83-foot-tall granite monolith.
It was sort of a giant halter. It was fastened onto the column. And then placed around it were capstans, which were manned by dozens of people. And at a given signal, they would all move, and through a pulley system, the column would gradually move upward and fall into the place that had been prepared for it on the base.
Today, the column remains freestanding on its pedestal at a full height of 155 feet.
It has proved to be absolutely perfectly engineered.
Napoleon's collapse eliminated any threat to Russia's status as the world's largest overland empire. By the turn of the 19th century, Russia stretched 6,000 miles from the Baltic Sea in the west to the Pacific in the east, and all the way to Alaska. It consisted of 1/6 of the world's landmass, crossed 15 time zones, and under a new Tsar, it would continue expanding.
And Nicholas II, because of his early experience traveling in Asia, the first of the Tsars to travel to Asian destinations, took into his reign a real conviction that Russia's future lay on the Pacific.
But with its territory now extending beyond the horizon, the empire was in danger of collapsing under its own size. Russia's engineers would execute a solution as far-reaching as the empire itself. They would build the Trans-Siberian Railroad.
Those who promoted the building of what was then the world's longest railroad in the 1890s had in mind both economic and political objectives. It was to open up the Far East to Russian exports. At the same time, it was to establish Russian power in the Far East.
On May 31st, 1891, the first piece was laid of a railroad that would span a distance of 5,768 miles, the equivalent of crossing the continental United States twice. This was an engineering project on a scale never before attempted.
The question of how the railway was built is frankly one that makes you sort of stop in awe.
The railroad was designed to be built in sections, and it would require thousands of workers, engineers, soldiers, and even convicts to do the job.
In a typical stretch of the railway cutting across vast areas of southern Siberian forest, an initial wave of workers would clear the land, felling the trees to open the path for the railroad. Then a great deal of labor would go into building necessary earth bulwarks to raise the rails. Then once the woods were cleared and the bulwark was established, the rails would be brought in and laid.
Transporting supplies to these remote sites would prove to be a major challenge. After all, the railroad did not yet exist. Tracks had to be laid piecemeal so that workers could use the emerging railroad to transport steel from the west and continue building section by section.
And this process was repeated week after week, month after month, over all the years of the late imperial period.
The endless toil broke the backs of Russia's workers.
It was a very hard job to take, very hard job to take. I mean, you got to conjure an image of isolated wilderness that was transformed into rough and ready workers' camps, with workers camped out under tents or in some cases in earthen dugouts, working for months at a time on stretches of track with relatively limited supplies in the winter, subject to extremely cold temperatures in the summer, to the terrific heat of Russia's continental climate.
By 1904, the core railroad was complete. Russia had a lifeline to the east and was free to pursue its next object of conquest, Asia.
The problem, of course, was that this put Russia into direct conflict with Japan, which had very similar political and economic objectives. This conflict of objectives led to war between Russia and Japan.
In 1905, Russia went to war and suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of the Japanese. Back at home, the loss fanned the flames of growing resentment toward the Tsar. Then in 1914, the Tsar led his country into yet another war, one that would starve, ravage, and utterly decimate the population. World War I. After centuries of building the world's largest empire with blood, the Russian Tsar was now pushing his people to their breaking point. On March 15, 1917, the people revolted. Tsar Nicholas II was removed from power. The nearly 500-year reign of the Russian Tsars had been destroyed.
The key factor in the disintegration of the Russian Empire in 1917-18 was the collapse of the Tsarist regime, because it was the emperor who really provided the glue that held the empire together.
The Tsars had used their power to build breathtaking cathedrals, whole cities from swamps, railroads that crossed a continent, and sumptuous palaces that remain unrivaled in their opulence.
The history of the Russian Empire can be read as an enormous achievement. At the same time, that achievement came at important costs. In many respects, the empire was built on the backs of ordinary Russians.
In late 1917, the Tsar's achievements would be rewritten by a new regime, one determined to level the playing field for Russia's poor.
As the mighty empire grew, it would consume more and more of its own to build a palatial playground for the rich and an industrial hell for the rest. By the beginning of the 20th century,